Alrighty, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to today's webinar on root zone management. We have a ton to cover today, so let's go ahead and get into it. So, just a little bit about FOHSE as we begin. We are one of the leading LED grow light manufacturers in the cannabis space. And our founders were previously invested in a local grow here in Nevada, and they experienced a ton of issues with the lighting options that were existing at the time. From limited canopy penetration to poor uniformity, chasing the canopy with the fixture itself. These are just some of the problems that they observed and they wanted to solve. So our founders sought out to start developing a new kind of fixture that would meet all of their needs, and that's the first iteration of that fixture was the A3i, our flagship fixture. Since then, we've expanded our footprint globally, and we are serving medical and recreational clients worldwide. To get into it, the ability to grow high-quality cannabis while meeting your yield targets, really it all starts in the root zone. Growers who can efficiently manage their root zone are going to cover a major part of plant management that's ultimately going to work to optimize plant health and your crop yield. So today we're going to cover a few actionable tips you can use in your grow space to help manage your root zone efficiently. Alrighty, and step one to that is going to be selecting the right growing media. So each media is going to have different properties, both with how much water they're able to hold and how they hold on to nutrients. So there are a few factors you should consider before deciding on the type of growing media for your facility. And that really comes down to two things, which is environment and your irrigation strategy. So we'll move into considering your environment first here. So no matter where you're growing, the outside environment is going to play a significant role on the temperature and the humidity within your facility. And with that in mind, gardeners can select a growing media that's more ideal for their localized space. For those of you with your environmentals down pat and your infrastructure is good, you have a little bit more freedom to choose a growing media that's more suitable for you. But for those growers who, no matter how much infrastructure you have currently, your VPD is still low or you're still having trouble with humidity, you'll want to select a growing media with a lower water holding capacity. And that's really in an effort to avoid overwatering and root rot. In high humidities, plants are not going to be transpiring a ton, so this will help mitigate that. And for growers on the opposite end of things, like here in Nevada, if you're in a drier condition, then you'll want a media with a higher moisture or water holding capacity. So environment is huge. As far as those types of media with a higher water holding capacity, you could go for a peat-based media like a Pro Mix, and then for things that are more porous, you can opt for a rock wool, a perlite, something of that nature. Okay, and the next step here on how to select the correct media for you is going to be deciding, are we going to hand water? Are we going to have an automated irrigation setup? Thinking about it logically, using a very porous media with good dry back potential while you're attempting to hand water is going to result in some problems. Typically, you're going to see a need to have more irrigation events, which typically isn't feasible if you have a small staff, you're expanding your facility, or you just don't have that much time to tend to the garden at home. So those who are hand watering are definitely going to benefit from growing media with a higher water holding capacity. Like we mentioned just a moment ago, peat-based mixes are awesome for that. And for growers who are looking to utilize automated irrigation setups, you have a little bit more freedom to use a media that has better drainage. So again, environment and irrigation are huge when you're trying to select your growing media, and it should be considered before you decide on one for your facility. So that's step one. Step two is going to be implementing some crop steering techniques as it pertains to irrigation. So for those of you who have heard of crop steering, this is going to be a little bit of a refresher on how to crop steer with your irrigation system. And for those who have not heard of crop steering or are not that familiar, it essentially refers to how gardeners are manipulating their growing inputs to achieve a desired result. So in our case today, we'll speak to how you can implement these techniques to promote more vegetative growth or more generative growth, depending on what your goals are. So for those of you who follow us on social, you may have seen a few Q&As on our stories in the last few days. We had one about vegetative irrigation sizes, and then we also had another that was talking about the differences between matrix versus osmotic potential. So in these next few sections, we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of that. But to start, we'll speak to vegetative cues, and what those are essentially are very low stress cues to the plant that ultimately help optimize the speed at which they're growing. So vegetative cues are focused on stem elongation, the development of foliage, and the development of your roots. As you see here, some of the vegetative cues that you can give to your plants are small irrigation events. Typically that looks like about 1 to 3% of the total volume of the media. You'll also want to have more frequent irrigation events. Typically, you don't want to space them out further than every 30 minutes. Typically, you want irrigation every 30 minutes until you achieve your target for the day. Low substrate ECs are also a vegetative cue, but that again is going to be relative to each variety. With those frequent irrigations come small drybacks, and ultimately you're going to have a large total irrigation window when you're steering vegetative. I guess before we go further, I want to dive deeper into these shot sizes and how you can solve for them for different sizes of growing media. So it's a simple two-step process to find shot size. And these shot sizes, they would be, like I mentioned a moment ago, 1 to 3% of the total substrate volume, not your field capacity. And to find the appropriate shot size, you'll want to take that volume of the substrate in liters and convert it to milliliters. So just a small example for you guys, a 2-gallon cocoa bag is 7.57 liters. When you convert that to milliliters, it's 7,570. So to get your shot size value, whether it's 1, 2, or 3%, you will take that percentage point and multiply it by your total substrate volume. So in this case, a 3% shot size for a substrate that is 7,570 milliliters is going to be a 227.1 milliliter shot. Additionally, for drybacks, you'll want to have somewhere between a 2 to 4% dryback between when your last irrigation event is and the lights go off. And then when the lights go on to your first irrigation event, you'll also want to see that same value of a dryback, about 2 to 4%. Keep in mind, too, growers, that the smaller your growing media is, the harder it is going to be over time to push your plants vegetatively. Reason being is as your plants are getting bigger, needing more water each day, that dryback is going to increase and just ultimately result in a generative cue. But that leads us into our next section here of generative cues. So generative cues are essentially intentional stress that we place on the plants, and the resulting behavior tends to signal to the plants, hey, I need to produce flowers, or I need to produce seeds so that my progeny can keep moving, or can keep living. So if you've ever seen flowers that are pretty airy in structure, maybe foxtail, or you're having these low potency values in flower, It could be because of a vegetative irrigation strategy too deep into flower as your plants are desiring a more generative irrigation strategy. So to cover some of those generative irrigation cues, you'll want to feed them larger shots each irrigation event, anywhere from 4 to 6% of the total substrate size. These irrigation events are going to have larger drybacks, so they're going to be less frequent, and you won't want to irrigate sooner than every 30 minutes. As you are getting into later flower, a good generative cue is a higher substrate EC. Again, this is relative to each variety. And you're going to want to complete your total irrigation for the day within a small window of time. So for generative drybacks, something to think about is you're going to want to see anywhere from that 4 to 6% dryback from lights off, or from last irrigation to lights off, and then another 4 to 6% from lights on to first irrigation. If you're looking to raise your substrate EC, it's ideal to decrease the number of maintenance shots that you're applying throughout the day. So essentially, as you're applying that first resaturation irrigation event at the beginning of the day, you would just be mitigating those maintenance shots in an effort to increase the dryback and then subsequently increase your EC. On the opposite hand, if you're looking to decrease your substrate EC, you can increase the number of maintenance shots, push more runoff, and in turn decrease that substrate EC. So let's see, vegetative and generative cues are super duper important for implementing into your irrigation strategy. Without it, there's typically an overuse of water or fertigation solution. You're typically not going to optimize crop health, especially in a hand-watered scenario. If you're hand-watering to leachate all the time, it's pretty hard to get those generative shot sizes correct. So let's see here. Moving on to point number 3 here on how we're managing our root zone better. You can utilize substrate sensor tech. So this is super duper cool. Many growers face challenges with plant nutrition, with managing how much am I feeding my plant in volumetric water content. And one way to alleviate this issue is to implement a sensor. So a substrate sensor is typically, as you see here, it's going to be made of metal probes which are connected to sensors. And those are physically inserted into the root zone or into the side of your media. These devices can monitor water content, temperature, and EC in the substrate. And that's super valuable because it can provide real-time data on what's going on. And a lot of these sensors are integrated with software to help track these metrics over time. So you have a timestamp of what you did, and you can always look back and make adjustments to your grow if need be. Without tools like these, you really can't align the results you're getting with the decisions you made. Everything is pretty muddy. So there are some really awesome companies out there that provide these sensors. Arroyo and GrowLink are definitely leaders in the cannabis space. They each have their own sensors with varying functionalities. And I will say on sensors, one other thing that you have to think about is not just the use of these sensors, but the sensor placement is also super key. Placement will be dependent on how much media you do have. Arroyo has an actual sensor alignment tool based on how much media you're growing in. So these tools are super helpful, and I definitely encourage all growers to spend the money and invest in this technology. Okay, so the next step to manage your root zone well is to collect runoff data. So Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Collecting runoff and their values is extremely important to understand how your plants are actively uptaking nutrients. If you have metrics on your inflow, feed, and substrate sensors at the root zone to complete the picture of what's going on with your irrigation and how your plants are responding, a good look at leachate is important, or runoff. So what ultimately is runoff though? So runoff is the spent water or nutrient solution that comes out of the bottom of your container or media after the media has reached field capacity. And again, field capacity is the total amount of water that a substrate can hold before it starts achieving that leachate. As plants are eating up those anions, the cation concentration will increase, ultimately lowering the pH of your runoff. And low pH in your runoff typically means that things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium will be less available for your plants to uptake in the root zone. And if your runoff on the other side is showing a high pH, some other elements like zinc and manganese will be less available. So utilizing your runoff data alongside the data derived from your substrate sensors and input feed values, it gives you a total picture of what you're dealing with in the grow. So with that said, how do you properly collect runoff or leachate? So yeah, it's important to note that there is a correct way to do this. For example, if you're in any part of this 4-step process, if you're pouring too much water or you achieve too much solution for your sample, it can throw off the values and make things less accurate as far as your pH and your EC readings. So to properly collect runoff, you start by pouring a pH-balanced nutrient solution into your growing media at a normal feed concentration. And you want to ensure that the growing media achieves field capacity, so you'll wait until you typically see a slow but visual drip. Then you're going to let the plants dry back for about 30 to 45 minutes. Allow that solution to be absorbed by the growing media adequately. And after the dry back is complete, you would prepare a small container with pH-balanced RO and pour a very small amount of that into your growing media until you achieve roughly 40 to 60 milliliters of runoff. The sweet spot is definitely 50 as far as getting an accurate reading. And beyond that, really, the more readings that you're able to take without interrupting your workflow, the better. Isolated data is not the best data. Having more readings is definitely going to give you more confidence in the data you are taking. So learning to take runoff is key. It will complete your picture of how your irrigation is making your plants behave. And finally, we will go into a few different tips on how to manage your root zone when utilizing high light intensity. So in implementing a higher degree of light intensity is a huge change in the grow. Light drives photosynthesis, specifically the intensity of light. So as you are increasing this plant metabolism, some other changes need to be made to avoid, keeping plant health out of balance. So this starts with understanding the lineage of each variety that you are growing. So it can't be said enough how important this is. The parental lineages of the cultivars that you're growing are going to greatly influence how they grow and how they express themselves. The environment that the parent stock grew in, whether it be in nature or in a grow chamber, greenhouse, it also plays a huge role. So for example, some varieties that were bred and selected for their performance under the intensity and spectrum of HPS fixtures may not be able to push as high of light intensity sometimes because their peak performance was under those settings. And when you alter that, they start to fall out of an optimal balance there. With high light intensity in mind, you'll want to select varieties that either grew or whose parents grew in conditions with naturally high light levels, or newer hybrid genetics with some high light preferring varieties in its lineage. Some examples of this are some equatorial varieties from places like Colombia or Hawaii. Some examples of the submodern hybrids that would be good for high light intensity would be your haze varietals. Beyond this, it's always good to experiment and figure out which varieties can handle high light because it isn't black and white. There are varieties that performed beautifully under HPS that perform to the same degree under LED or greater, and only re-pheno-hunting your genetics under LEDs and higher intensities are really going to give you a clear picture of what genetics can handle that and can't. Typically, your varieties with a higher light intensity or who prefer higher light intensity are going to have a higher light saturation point. And this is really good for commercial cultivators and home cultivators alike for pumping yield. But again, you should always consider your genetics lineage when you're starting to run them under LEDs, and potentially just set it in your mind that you need to have a trial period and figure out which genetics are going to work best under what conditions. So that is huge. Step 2 to managing your root zone under high light intensity is we're going to increase our feed concentration. So another way to adapt is we need to be feeding them a higher concentration of nutrients than we were previously to meet the needs of that higher rate of plant metabolism. Higher light intensities are going to, pending the cultivar, I apologize. Let's see here. Lost my place. So I guess just to back up and speak to the science a bit, this goes into one of the stories that I was speaking about on our socials where we talked about matrix versus osmotic potential. Matrix is the force that the roots have to overcome to absorb water from the growing media, and osmotic potential is the force that roots have to overcome to extract water in a high EC environment. So this being said, the inside of your plant roots typically have a higher EC value than the plant's root zone, just so that the water flows naturally with that osmotic gradient. When you're raising your EC too dramatically before your plant's root zone has been conditioned to that higher EC, it makes it quite difficult for your plants to absorb the water and available nutrients. So for some varieties, you'll want to see the substrate EC slowly stack and veg to being greater than your feed EC to avoid any nutritional issues. But that's not always necessary. So it's important to implement one of a few things in this case. You can either increase the inflow concentration of your feed, or you can feed more maintenance shots. Both of these strategies are going to accomplish the same goal. But you will notice that some varieties are going to have more of an optimal performance with a lower substrate EC, and some will have an optimal performance with a slightly higher substrate EC. So that is definitely like varietal dependent and something that you guys as growers are going to have to sort out. But on a general basis, we do see the need for feeding at an increased concentration. So 2.5 to 3.5 EC is a super common range we see used. Okay, and another step to managing the root zone under high light intensity is going to be altering your irrigation strategy after you defoliate. So what's super common in the cannabis space these days, not everybody does it, but many cultivation facilities are heavily stripping their plants. And this can, it can achieve some really desirable results as far as pumping the yield and the quality of your flowers. What defoliation does is it will stress your plants, but when you're using it properly, it's going to increase airflow into your canopy, which mitigates the risk of any mold or PM issues. And additionally, it's going to increase light intensity to your lower canopy. This is going to further drive photosynthesis on your lowers. And this is huge because I've noticed it myself from personally using a pretty heavy defoliation practice that it really does help when you do it adequately for that cultivar. That being said, you can do too much defoliating, and then ultimately you could stunt your yield. But as it pertains to defoliation and high light intensities, one, as you defoliate, you'll want to dim your light intensity a bit for the next 24 to 48 hours. Your plants are going to be super stressed and be going through basically slower rates of metabolism. So to meet those needs as well, you're going to need to alter your irrigation strategy to basically decrease the total fertigation volume that you're feeding. Additionally, something to think about on defoliation, our leaves, they send us messages on what's happening inside the plant. It's important not to defoliate too much, or else we lose these messages that the plant can give us. But it's important to defoliate properly, defoliate with a goal. And again, if you're doing it under high light intensity, dim your light fixtures for a day or two until the plants bounce back. And to meet those needs with irrigation, also, we're going to be decreasing the total fertigation volume. Let's see. All right. Well, that about wraps up the presentation portion. I'm going to go ahead and begin the Q&A. If you guys have any questions, please definitely leave them in the chat box here, and I'll make sure I get to them all. Okay. So let's see. Stop share. Sorry about that. Okay, so first question I see is from Benny Gardner. It says, define shot size for me, please. So the shot size is going to be the irrigation event that you feed to your plant. And it's going to be the amount of fertigation that you're feeding. So like we mentioned before, you're going to take your total substrates volume, and you're going to, if you're shooting for a more vegetative approach, you multiply that value in milliliters by 1 to 3%. And if you're shooting for a generative shot size, then you would multiply the total volume by 4 to 6%. So I hope that answered that for you. Let's see, Michael asks, with all those small shots, do you flush daily with a big shot at lights out? Don't salts build up in your substrate? So definitely the goal of these smaller shots is to build up the concentration in the substrate a little bit and meet the needs of plant metabolism as your plants are wanting more and more food. But a daily flushed shot is not necessary to maintain that balance in the root zone. It's a good question though, Michael. Okay, let's see. Joe has a really good question here. Joe says, after defoliation, you said dim your lights and lower your shot size. Would lowering the CO2 level also apply? So just to clarify, Joe, dimming the lights is definitely needed, but what you're going to do is not lower the shot size, but you'll be lowering the total amount of fertigation volume you're feeding throughout the day, just so they're drinking and receiving less in total. But to your CO2 question, absolutely, CO2 should increase and decrease in tandem with your light intensity. So as you're decreasing that light intensity, it's definitely good to decrease the CO2 for a couple days. Good question. Okay. Okay, Felipe has a question. He says, when I irrigate, how can I know in the vegetative photoperiod that I am done with the roots, and is it okay to change photoperiod? I think what Felipe is asking is sort of, how does he know basically when root production is done so that he can flip to flower? And the answer with that, you might be shocked, but for the first few weeks of flower, the plants are bolting and they're going through a sort of vegetative growth period in which the roots are also still growing. So you should expect root growth through early flower. Yeah, I hope that answers that for you, Felipe. Let's see. Scott has a question. He says, I have been struggling with keeping roots healthy and white in my media while focusing on a vegetative irrigation strategy. Do you have any tips for keeping my roots full and white without overwatering? Yeah, totally. So the precision shot sizes, with your vegetative irrigation strategy, you're going to have a higher total water volume typically throughout the day. So that it is obviously going to present the possibility for you to, if conditions go awry, to start to experience that root rot. One thing I do is, in addition to managing my shot sizes, is I implement a product called Hygrozyme. And it's a beneficial enzyme that eats away at plant roots as they're starting to decay. And it just keeps your roots nice and fresh. It keeps those fibrous root hairs developing. But essentially you could implement a product like Hygrozyme, but I would be curious to know what your VPD is looking like, Scott, especially if you're utilizing a vegetative irrigation strategy. Shoot me an email after the webinar, Anthony@FOHSE.com. I'd love to dive deeper and figure out what might be going on there, but I feel like it might have something to do with transpiration and how your environment's working. All right. Let's see. Okay, Benjamin is wondering, what are some basic examples of low feeding, medium feeding, and high feeding cultivars? For instance, a low feeding cultivar could generally stack to XEC later in flower, while a high feeding cultivar can generally stack to YEC. So we do see general parameters that I'll give in a second, but I'll definitely say this is cultivar to cultivar because things can just vary so much with all the hybrids we have these days. But I will say that most of your low EC cultivars, they typically, in my experience alone, they tend to prefer between the 3 to 5 EC if you're feeding roughly a 2.5 to a 3 EC. With that same feed EC, the substrate EC can be a little bit higher for average cultivars, upwards of almost a 7, and then the higher feeding cultivars, they can really stack their EC very high within the media. Not all of them, again, because what we've learned from the science is that there are certain cultivars that they don't need a substantially higher substrate EC than the feed EC, so long as the feed concentration is increase to meet their needs, the substrate EC does not necessarily need to increase in tandem. But I hope that answers that question for you, Benjamin. Let's see here. Ishmael asks, how many hours of day and night does cannabis need to grow, and what is the ideal level of light? This is a little bit of a loaded question, but I'll do my best here. So as far as hours of day and night, it's going to depend on if you have either an auto-flowering genetic or a photoperiod genetic. Auto-flowering genetics are going to be things that have cannabis ruderalis in it, and that genetic basically, it tells these plants to, after a given period of time in day length, in the number of days, I should say, to flower, whereas the photoperiod can be flowered just by manipulating the light cycle down towards a 12-12. But most people are using 18 hours for veg, 12 hours for flowering. That being said, Ishmael, it's not concrete. I've seen plants start flowering in 14 hours of light, 13 hours of light. A lot of this is going to be cultivar dependent. So I hope that answers your question there. Amber has a good question here. Typically, I've flushed the last 2 weeks of a cycle. What do you recommend for the last 2 weeks? So what I recommend, definitely as we're ripening toward the end there, is to taper your feed concentration. I definitely don't subscribe to flushing with RO water only at the end of the cycle. Main reason being is it causes a lot of cellular issues within the flower tissue. When you're starving them of the calcium they need to form like a strong cell structure, you start to basically see that some of these crops that looked beautiful and grow and were flushed toward the end end up with a higher concentration of mold post-harvest. So really the key there is, as you're ripening and decreasing your feed concentration, you want to decrease it, but definitely go for no more than 50% of your regular inflow. So if you were feeding a 3.0 EC inflow, I wouldn't go lower than a 1.5 when you're tapering that feed toward the end of the cycle. Just again, to ensure that your flower has integrity and it can survive any variances that occur post-harvest. That was a really good question, Amber. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay. Okay. I see someone says, Brett says, what is your ideal day temp and night temp differential? Any effect on yield with different day and night differentials, i.e. 72 or 82 day, 72 night as a 10 diff, or 82 day, 77 night as a 5 diff? So definitely you're in the right range there with the 5 to 10, Brett. On yield, I personally haven't noticed major differences. I have noticed differences as it pertains to how the bud fades and picks up its color toward the end of the cycle. It really seems like the bigger the diff there, the better color you're going to get out of your flowers. So again, haven't noticed anything personally on yield, but definitely as far as the bag appeal of your flowers. Super good questions so far. Let's see here. Okay, Scott has another question here. He says, how do substrate meters compare within using them with rock wool versus coco coir? So what I will say there is that, like I mentioned in the substrate section, consistency is super key. Although placement is key, the consistency is key. So rock wool tends to have a very uniform consistency throughout, whereas cocoa has varying grades. You know, there's your pith, which is going to be a lot more finer with a higher water holding capacity. It might be a little easier to make contact with those probes. And then, you know, some of the cocoa with bigger chips of cocoa coir, you know, you might have a little bit of trouble trying to make contact there. But as far as from rock wool to cocoa, it can be very akin on the results as far as if you have rock wool and a very pithy based medium with a higher water holding capacity. So they're really going to mainly vary as far as the data you're receiving whenever you're starting to change the grade of cocoa that you're using to one that's a little bit more chippy and porous. You just might have more trouble making contact with those sensors. Awesome question. Okay. Benjamin B asks, excuse me, does the ideal plant densities change from LED to HPS as well as from cocoa to rock wool? Are there general recommendations for these variables in high density, high intensity LED commercial cultivation? Ben, would you mind elaborating just, are you speaking to, when you say plant densities, like how many plants are under a fixture? Would you mind elaborating there? I'd love to answer your question. Okay. These have been really awesome questions thus far. Again, if you have any questions, please keep submitting them here. Try and knock out as many as I can before this is done. So perlite, growing in perlite, a good EC range, again, as far as veg and flower, I'm not a huge fan of switching up the EC concentration that much, because again, it makes it harder for the plant to absorb nutrients when they get sort of shocked with a higher EC. So as I mentioned before, 2.5 to 3.5 should be ideal inflow, and that's for veg and flower. But you're going to notice, again, certain cultivars, they will prefer, they're not as heavy of feeders. They're average feeders and they're heavier feeders. And each of those can utilize different EC concentrations inflow. So that's a good question, Jorge. Thank you. Okay. Scott says, where can I find your email? So again, for anybody who wants my email, it's anthony@FOHSE.com. And that's my work email here. I'm on standby for various horticulture questions that you guys have. So please, Scott, send that along to anthony@FOHSE.com, and we can dive deeper into what's going on with your environment and, you know, your sort of overwatering troubles. Let's see. Ishmael says, when is the best time to harvest cannabis for optimal potency and flavor? Again, this is going to greatly vary, but what we see generally speaking is that varieties that come from, or that are typically, you know, referred to as your more indica plants, they are going to require not too many days to flower. I've heard of varietals flowering in 49 days, but most of your hybrid varieties today that are 9-week cultivars are going to need a full 9 weeks. So just plan on a 63-day harvest there. And then your equatorial varieties can be really crazy. They can go 10, 12, 14, 16 weeks. It can take a really long time for some of those other ones. But again, I would use the combination of harvest time and the subjective view under a jeweler's loop to try and see where your trichomes are at to determine when that best time is to harvest each strain. Okay, another question here. This isn't a root zone management question, but can you speak to the ideal post-harvest drying environment to keep the integrity of the flower? Yeah, 100%. So the tried and true set points for the longest now that many cultivators use is 60-60. So that's 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 60% relative humidity as far as your dry down. And this is most ideal, I'll say, like for a whole plant hang. There are some strategies that I've tried before where we'll take a temperature and humidity that's akin to how the room is when we chop it, and we'll slowly work to 60-60. But what I've seen as far as just how both methods work and what kind of product they're producing, just throwing freshly harvested plants into a 60-60 environment is going to be great. It's a set it and forget it method, and it's tried and true there. Beyond that, you'll want to keep your storage space where the buds are being burped and stored and all that in a similar condition. And if your room can't get to 60-60, if you can only achieve 62 degrees, you'll want to have an equal and opposite integer value on your relative humidity as well. So if you're 2 degrees above 60-60 for temperature, then go for a 58% humidity. We really just want to use that 60-60 as like as the guidepost for how you're drying. And I will say again, burping is a huge part of this and how your post-harvest team is handling the product, how long totes are open. Again, like burp times, not every strain will need a 15-minute burp. Maybe they only need 10 minutes and they need it twice a day. It's just, it will vary per strain. But as far as those dry down conditions, 60-60 is the goal. But keep it as close to 60-60 as possible. It's not a novel answer, but it's a good one. It'll work for you. Let's see. Okay, it looks like I still have a few more questions here. So what I'm going to do is just suggest to all y'all, if I did not answer your questions, please shoot me an email. I'll be happy to follow up with you guys right after the webinar finishes up. And that'll be at anthony@FOHSE.com, and I'll be able to dive into the rest of your questions there. But really appreciate you guys for joining me this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are. It's been a really good talk, and I look forward to the next one.